So I thought we were going to be able to do this in my hotel room, but I guess we just barely outsized it. But I always tell them, whenever I'm speaking at an event in Las Vegas, I tell them I want the first session in the morning because only the best and the brightest and the most dedicated technologists show up to the first session in the morning in Las Vegas. So I'm Joe. I'm a this is my official title at Microsoft, Opinionated Misfit Geek. I'm also known as a Senior Program Manager in the DevTools and Platform Group. And I've spent the last 6 years at Microsoft talking to folks primarily in Scott Guthrie's team, and Scott's the guy I work for, about dynamic languages in the Windows world, and PHP in particular. How many of you are PHP programmers now? One? And the rest of you are here, why? PHP wannabes. How come?
The scalability of it is very interesting. I read Cal Henderson's book, How You Build Flickr.
Okay.
And, he really talked about, the scalability.
That's interesting because I've asked that question probably 100 times and I've never had scalability be an answer. So that's good to hear. Anybody else? Okay, yep, that's a great answer. We have to talk to PHP developers and talk about why it's great to run, or why they want to run PHP on Windows. Great. Anybody else? So, just by way of note, so I'm not a marketing muffin. I've been a real PHP developer for 8 or 9 years. I've got a couple of sports-related sites that I run on PHP CMSs. The most popular of which got 2 million unique visitors last year. So I do PHP stuff in the real world. And so I love this. I've studied a lot of Albert Einstein's work. And Albert Einstein said something that has really guided my career. And he said, the significant problems of today can't be solved with the kinds of thinking that created those problems in the first place. Historically, when we made software decisions in companies, the first decision was build or buy. And we made the buy decision if we could find something that was close enough to the feature set that we needed. And if we couldn't, then we made the build decision. And as technologists, when we chose a development stack, we chose one based on what we thought was going to have all of the features we need that wasn't going to present us with any roadblocks. And if you were the person that made that decision, you then spent the months or years following that with a nagging little voice worrying about whether some as yet undefined and unpredictable feature was going to introduce or expose the roadblock or the incapability of the technology stack that you've chosen. And that's probably happened to all of us. So now we live in internet time where a year is 3 months long, and we really can't afford to hit those roadblocks. And it's happened to all of us, right? I mean, if you've been programming for more than 5 or 6 years, you've run up against things like you just can't do multi-threading in VB5, or there's just no way to access shared memory in COBOL if you're a really old programmer. So for me, do we all agree that PHP is a popular web development technology? Why is it popular? How did it get to be popular? Number one, barrier of entry is very low. It's easy, right? So one of the things that I think we at Microsoft have made a mistake in doing is we've comparatively spoken about PHP and our ASP.NET technologies in very qualitative terms. Strict object orientation is better. Strong typing is better. And I agree that for some development purposes those things are better, but those are really philosophical issues. And one of the advantages of dynamic languages can be that it's much more simple to get started with. You don't have to design in a complete object hierarchy before you can write the first functional pieces of your application. So low intellectual barrier of entry. What else?
It's a perception issue. .NET is perceived as something that is okay for the enterprise and not okay for small sites. That's what we're hearing from customers.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's part of the same thing, though, that there's the perception that you need to make this big intellectual investment to do any .NET programming, and you don't need to do that in PHP. And you're right. I think that's a perception. I think that if you make those decisions based on the low end, then you're going to run into barriers no matter what stack you choose. But so low intellectual barrier of entry is the first reason that PHP has been popularized. Give me another one. Okay, that's a really interesting point. So it's cross-platform, and I actually don't believe that the fact that it's cross-platform matters. But I think the thing that does matter is that 80% of PHP developers develop on a Windows box and deploy on a Linux box. Why is that? Why do 80% of developers who know that they're going to deploy on a Linux box anyway do their development work on a Windows box? The tools are better, right? By a significant stretch, the tools are better. Especially if you look at the latest generation of tools. PHP Ed from Newsphere just released version 5. It's awesome. Borland, who has made great dev tools for a really long time, just released Delphi for PHP. Has anybody played with it? Check it out. It's awesome. It's great. So dev tools. There's one other thing. Why do those 80% deploy to Linux instead of Windows? It's cheaper. So that's one of the reasons. Although the business guys all argue about initial software investment cost versus total cost of ownership, but I actually think that's one of the big reasons for the growth in popularity in PHP is that the startup costs are cheaper, and where that's made a real difference is in the hosting world. So PHP at its core is free, and Linux, from a software acquisition perspective, is free and hosting friendly. So developers could choose PHP because there was going to be a place where they could deploy that on a shared account that cost $9 a piece. And in fact, I've never talked to a large organization, and I often go and talk about the merits of one dev stack versus another. I've never talked to a large company that made a strategic decision to use PHP as their standard. It grows organically. There's a problem to solve. Some developer says, oh, I can go get a PHP app that's already written, that's open source. I can modify it over the weekend, show it to my boss on Monday, and be a hero when they put that prototype into production 3 days later. Right? So, but now that hosting costs have been driven down so that they're fairly close for Windows. If you include Microsoft SQL Server versus MySQL, there's still a disparity there. But why are so few people running PHP applications on a Windows box in production? Does anybody got to take a stab at it? Performance? Performance is what? Yeah, they've actually, the PR group has asked me to remove the word sucks from my presentation vocabulary, so I'll say the performance has historically been suboptimal. Why? So I cover this a little bit later on in the talk, but let's get this out of the way now. There's a fundamental difference in the way PHP runs on Windows and the way PHP runs on Unix-like operating systems. And it stems from the original operating system designs. And if you're an operating system weenie, then please forgive my oversimplification. But basically, when Unix was designed, they made a design decision to make threads and processes pretty close to the same in terms of resource intensity. So you can spawn up a new process on a Unix or Unix-derived operating system at roughly the same cost in resources to spawning a new thread. Windows was designed by some of the same guys that designed VMS, and the different decision that they made was to make spawning a new thread extremely lightweight, but spawning a new process a heavier. In fact, spawning a new process on Windows is the most processor-intensive instruction. Causes a hard page fault, and that's is a pretty heavyweight operation to spawn a new process. Now, where this becomes a problem with PHP is that since PHP sort of grew up in Unix-like operating systems, it primarily is built to run as a CGI application. And that means that every request causes a CGI instance to be fired up, which means a new process. On Unix and Linux, not such a big deal. On Windows, kind of a big deal. And this is where the performance barrier has come. Now, the folks at Zend is the commercial company that is sort of the guardian of PHP, and a lot of folks don't realize that. PHP is a free open source application, but it's controlled by a commercial entity, which in my opinion is a good thing because they control what goes in and what doesn't, and they keep the simple focus of PHP. But they've written an ISAPI, a version that runs in the web server's process on IIS, which would eliminate those performance problems. However, until recently, the ISAPI extension that was PHP in and of itself wasn't ensured to be thread safe. Now it is, but we don't write PHP applications using just the core PHP, right? We use extensions, we use PECL extensions, we use pair extensions, and there's just no way to ensure that all of that code is thread safe. So really, even on Windows, you have to run PHP as a CGI application, and that is where the performance problem comes. You had a question?
Are they open sourcing the ISAPI filter, or is that just a commercial offering?
I can't speak to what Zend will or won't do, but the truth of the matter is that that I don't think the ISAPI version will ever reach any significant adoption because it would require all the libraries that you use to be guaranteed to be thread safe, and that just won't happen. However, we've collaborated with Zend. We announced last year a formal partnership with Zend, and we've solved this performance problem, or I should say we're in the process of solving this performance problem by implementing a fast CGI module for IIS, which basically is a process pooling mechanism. And our early benchmarks show that, I mean, I've seen some benchmarks that show 1,000-time improvements in performance. The reliability problem of the ISAPI version of PHP goes away as well because every PHP application running on IIS using that fast CGI extension gets its own process space. So all of the poor reliability problems that occur because of those thread safety issues go away because thread safety becomes a non-issue. Right? So we're well on the way to solving that problem. There are some other things that IIS brings to the table, by the way, that I think can be advantageous as well. But for me, this was a big jump start into me really starting to want to embrace doing some work in PHP. And the reason is I built this site, the original version of this site, with all of the functionality that you see there, forums, contact member lists, private messaging, all that stuff, and I built it in an afternoon. And if I wanted all that functionality in ASP or Cold Fusion or Java or anything else, I was going to have to build it all from scratch because there wasn't an existing application out there that did all that stuff. And while at Microsoft we've tried to do a lot of work to catalyze the ASP.NET community to do applications like this, there are nowhere near as many as in other technologies as there are in PHP. And oh, by the way, when I got bored with the look, it took me 5 minutes to completely reskin the application because there's a whole bunch of designers out there that do work for these applications like this CMS. And for me, that's just amazing if you're artistically challenged like I am, which basically means I can't do any real look and feel stuff myself. So before we get into technology, just a couple of notes about Microsoft and open source. We are not, in fact, open source, anti-open source at Microsoft. We look at open source products just like we do any other products. Some of them compete with the things that we run our business on and others don't. It's that simple. What we're not fans of is the GPL and the viral nature of the GPL. And my personal opinion, Microsoft doesn't say this, but my personal opinion is that one of the things I don't like about the GPL is that for all of the discussion about freedom in open source, the GPL tells me what I can and can't do with the intellectual property that I develop, and for me that's problematic. But at Microsoft, my team does real open source. If you look at the Ajax stack that we released this year, all of the server and all of the client-side stuff, including demo implementations on non-Microsoft platforms, is all open source, completely open source stuff. So we do open source where you folks tell us it matters and where you want it, and of course where it matches our business needs. So one of the things that I tend to want to remind people is that even though PHP grew up in the Linux world, Linux and PHP are not inextricably linked, and I actually think that the vocabulary at Microsoft has exacerbated this identity because we use the word LAMP a lot and sort of created this association that if you choose PHP, you're by default not choosing anything that's Microsoft. So one of the reasons you might want to run PHP on Windows, the PHP space, only a couple of you said you were actually PHP developers. PHP has a huge open source ecosystem, and there are tons and tons and tons of applications that are out there that you can download. They run as source code, so you can download them, you can modify them to your heart's content, and for lots of application work, that's a great place to start. I never could have taken the time to build a portal like PHP Nuke. How many of you are PHP developers? Right, so I apologize. I know that PHP Nuke is sort of no longer in vogue and has been displaced by other other newer applications. But I'm sort of an old guy, and I still love PHP Nuke, even though it's got some issues. There's also a lot of designers that work with these technologies and contribute their designs to the open source ecosystem. And a lot of developers like the sort of loose and wild nature of PHP, and that's what causes a lot of these applications to be developed in the open source model. Also, I find that PHP developers tend to be extremely pragmatic as opposed to religious about the work that they do. So there's a lot of great interoperability stuff that comes out of the PHP community. And of course, Zen and Microsoft are both specifically invested in extending PHP to work well on Windows, and on our side, extending the Windows server infrastructure to be one of the best places to run PHP. So here's just a subset of some of the favorite PHP applications. And if you look at these, I've run all of these on Windows. But if you look at these, Sugar CRM, for example, is just a huge feature-rich CRM application you can download and run at no cost. And because it's written in PHP and it ships as source code, you can extend it. Some of the advantages to choosing Windows as the platform. First is the Windows ecosystem. We've got over 600,000 development partners, and that means that when you can, if you have a specific functionality that you want to buy instead of build, that's great. For example, I was working a while ago with a government agency, and they had a couple of interesting requirements, and they were using a CRM system that was based on PHP, and they were using a learning system that was based on PHP. And it was a collaborative learning system, so that people in their agency all contributed to the education that was found there. But they had a really interesting federally mandated requirement that everything that they published would be scanned for any sort of gender bias and would be evaluated to be of, I think it was a 6th or 7th grade reading level. And they couldn't publish anything that didn't conform to those. And it turns out that the logic, particularly to evaluate a document for 6th grade reading level, that logic is fairly complex. They were able to go buy a third-party library from a Microsoft partner as a DLL and call it from their PHP code. And they were able to get that up and running in about 48 hours, as opposed to maybe 20 man-months it would take to write that filtering logic from scratch. So Microsoft makes lots of stuff. Anybody know what the #1 used database in the world is? Excel. Yeah. So Microsoft makes lots of stuff, and when you can, sometimes there are advantages to being able to get multiple pieces of the composite application that you're going to build from one vendor. Larry Ellison coined the term "one throat to choke." Right? So just some of the additional stuff that Microsoft builds that you might want to extend. And of course, at this show, you're hearing a lot about Silverlight, a lot about Microsoft Ajax, and a lot about the new live services. And I'll show you in a demo that I've built where I'm including all of these from inside PHP code in a CMS. So Silverlight, Microsoft Ajax, and the live services are all fully accessible to PHP developers. And I'll show you that in demos. Right? But sometimes there are things that you just can't do when you make a choice based on simplicity. Does any of you folks that are PHP developers, name a kind of thing that you can't do in PHP that might be a roadblock? Right, so somebody mentioned scalability as one of their interests in PHP. One of the things that I ran up against is I've run up against 2 performance problems in PHP. One is in this day of federated services where we're calling web services and aggregating the results. In PHP, there's no easy way without writing a C module. There's no easy way to asynchronously call web services, meaning I want to fire off calls to these 6 web services, and then whenever those responses come back, because there's different latency factors for each one, I just want to be able to use an event handler to handle whenever those calls get back. There's no way to do that easily in PHP, but you get it for free in ASP.NET. So I was able to write a little ASP.NET module that did those calls and then called each of those 6 services asynchronously, and then sent the results back to my PHP code in one single callback. Same with multi-threading. You can't do multi-threading in PHP, but sometimes you might need an application that's going to do multi-threading. So you can write a component in something else, maybe C# or Visual Basic, and do it that way. All right, so we talked about this. Let's hop into an application. So one of the first things I want to show you that I think is interesting about PHP on Windows is I had a problem a while ago where I'd written some extensions to a content management system, but I was also using CRM on the same, the Sugar CRM on the box, and when I went to deploy my application, Sugar CRM required PHP 4.x, so it wouldn't run on PHP 5. But the extensions that I'd written that I now wanted to deploy used the object-oriented and XML extensions from PHP 5, and it turned out that it was a really difficult thing to do to run 2 different versions of PHP on the same box at the same time without changing the file name extensions for one of those applications, which meant every place you referenced a file, you had to go in through the code and change it. There is a way to do that on Linux, by the way, by using the htaccess file, but I actually couldn't get it to work the way that I needed it to. I couldn't get it to work reliably. So one of the cool things is I have a default implementation of PHP here that is PHP 5. But you'll notice also on localhost, so running against the same IIS server, I have another application that's running PHP 4. And just for fun, there's a managed code version, so a full .NET version of PHP called Phalange that you can get if you're interested in playing with that. You can get it at codeplex.com. It's our Microsoft's open source repository. And you'll notice all 3 of these are running on open source. So one of the things that happens in the open source world is that they don't have the same sort of bindings that commercial organizations like Microsoft have to ensure backward compatibility. So sometimes when you go from one major version to the next, you have to retrofit things. This is really easy to do, not just from a version perspective, but let me show you in the IIS manager. So my default website has a handler mapping for PHP applications, and I've said point at this instance of PHP. Right? So in this case, my default one is the ISAPI version of PHP, which I probably wouldn't use in production. But then in this subdirectory, I've been able to say, for all of the PHP files that you find in this subdirectory, use this instance of PHP. And then for the managed code version, I can just say, when you have a file extension PHP, use the ASP.NET 2.0 runtime instead of a native PHP handler. And in addition to how you want to map the file extensions, you can also get really specific about how you allocate resources. So for example, if I know that PHP 4 has a memory leak, for example, I can put it in its own application pool and say, only allow X number of processes or threads to be run in this application pool, only allow a certain amount of memory, or recycle this application pool when this application pool starts to use more than 20% of the CPU resources. So there's some really powerful things that you can do with IIS. Generally speaking, what's the problem with IIS? What's wrong with IIS? Runs on Windows. Who said that? Sir, I'd like you to come sit right here, please. Now, what's wrong with IIS? What's historically wrong with IIS? Well, it doesn't have an htaccess. Okay, I don't know if there's anything you can't do in another way, but from a large web farm perspective, the fact that you have to use a user interface to do a lot of the administrative stuff that you can do easily by distributing a single htaccess file to all the machines, that's problematic in a large environment, sure. What else? Right, so the 2 big things that historically we've had problems with, IIS hasn't been secure versions 4 and 5, and hasn't been manageable in large organizations. Starting with IIS-6 and moving forward to IIS-7, basically IIS-6 was a complete re-architecture. So I hope you'll get a chance to go see, I think Bill Staples is doing an IIS-7 talk here, which will show you how everything is scriptable, everything is configurable through config files, similar to what you do with htaccess. So we've really heard that feedback and solved lots of those problems. So I've got an application here. This is a PHP CMS application. It's XOOPS, if anybody's played with it. And let me just log in. And in here, I've embedded a bunch of integrated with Microsoft's technologies. So for example, I mentioned earlier that the most used database on the planet is Excel. And every company I talk to has some experience like this. There's an executive that has he keeps some data in a spreadsheet, and he wants to send that spreadsheet to somebody and have that data appear on the web. And they come up with these workflow processes. But wouldn't it be great if the guy could just send the spreadsheet every Monday morning to one of his webmasters and have them use that data without having to jump through a bunch of hoops? So, for example, this page collects data out of an Excel spreadsheet. Now you can automate Excel using COM, and I'm going to show you the COM interface in a minute, but I actually suggest that you don't do that. In the new versions of Office, XML is a native format, so you can actually use the spreadsheets and read and write XML natively. So let's just make a couple of changes here. So let's pretend I'm the executive who's just telling me that I might lose some special features if I save as XML. Right, so just simply by changing the spreadsheet that's in the directory, the only inhibition there is that if the file system has performance contentions, then those will be exposed by reading from a file. But other than that, really simple workflow process. Doing that is really simple in PHP 5. This is just I'm using NewSphere as the editor, and this is just a NewSphere project for the whole CMS that I'm programming against. And because under the covers it's just XML, right? Very easy. I just load up. In this case, I'm using a static file location, but just create a DOM object, load it up, and iterate through the XML, and the columns become document objects, elements in the XML file. Similarly, remember I mentioned earlier about a company that I work with that had to evaluate the documents that were being published in their organization. You do the same thing with Word files. So I can say, let's go find a file that I want to process. And I can, same way, iterate through the document file. You notice here it's pulling out the forbidden words in this resume file. And the code is similarly easy, right? I'm just iterating through. So the fact that we've now started to support standards in the Office documents makes them really easy to use Office documents as part of your standard data workflow process. One of the things to remember about the stuff that Microsoft produces is that basically everything that we produce is accessible from one of 3 API types. You can either access it as a COM object, you can access it as a .NET object, or you can access it through an XML web service, all of which you can get to from PHP. So to be a little bit more specific, let's look at calling something through COM. And just by way of background, PHP running on Windows has a COM extension Truly speaking, it's not actually COM, it's OLE 2.0 compliance, but there's a guy named Wes Furlong who actually is here at the conference. He'll be sitting on a panel with me tomorrow morning talking about ASP.NET and PHP sort of coexisting in the same world. He wrote this interface, and it's really pretty easy to program against. What I'm doing here is just reporting the number of free bytes on the drive where this application is running on. And that code is in an existing COM object. So sometimes, let me see if I can... So this is VB6. I know it looks weird running on Vista, but it does work. And one of the great things about COM is that Windows has all of this COM stuff that's accessible. So when you want to make an operating system call, rather than having to write a C-based extension to PHP, a lot of times you can use the existing infrastructure to just make a simple call to get the information that you want. So in this case, it's just a few line of codes that create a COM object that will find out how many bytes of disk space are left available. So this sort of thing, runtime diagnostics that are machine specific, if you've ever worked in a very large web farm environment, these sorts of things can be hard to acquire and really important. A lot of times when you have a performance or another operational defect in a deployed application, you can't duplicate that in your test and QA environment. The company that I owned before I started Microsoft, we specialized in scalability and performance problems. And a lot of times the only way to find out what the problem is and how to solve it is to introduce low-impact data acquisition inside the production environment, because it just doesn't happen when the application isn't under random load like it is in your production web farm. So this was the kind of thing that we actually did frequently in applications that we needed to identify performance and scalability problems with. So this is just a standard VB. Notice I'm actually just calling a kernel 32 API. But in my PHP code, I'm just newing up an instance of the COM interface that is the one that was created. And then once I've created that object, I can program against the methods and the properties that are in that COM object, just like there were any other PHP object instance. And if you think about that, that exposes just a mass of existing Windows-based logic by way of COM objects to the PHP programmer without a whole lot of work. All you have to do is understand the interface, what the methods and properties that you want to call into that PHP application are. And if you're sort of a coding purist, I know that syntax looks a little ugly. What I often do is wrap that in a, because I work primarily in PHP 5, I wrap that in a PHP object, and then I can use real PHP syntax. Right. Any questions about PHP and COM? Yes? You would have preferred? Yeah, sure. So don't get stuck on the example of showing the number of bytes that are left, right? So you're absolutely right. So the point there is that WMI, for example, has a rich COM interface, as does things like Active Directory. So the point isn't this is how you get the number of bytes that are available on the disk. The point is that's how easy the mechanism for calling into COM objects are, and things like WMI has a full COM interface. Active Directory has a full COM interface. And all of those things are now accessible through this COM interface that is available as it's the standard distribution extension that ships with PHP for Windows. And there are a lot of times where, for example, WMI is a great way and sometimes the only way to get to certain kinds of information about what's going on the box that your application is running on. And there are other more business level functionalities that are important too. So Active Directory, for example. Lots of folks run their identity management in Active Directory and want to plug in their PHP application. They've got, they're using Sugar CRM, for example, but they want, they want Active Directory to be their unified authentication mechanism. Well, Active Directory has a COM interface. Even things like Exchange. A lot of people think Exchange is just a mail server, but Exchange has a bunch of built-in functionality that if you had to write from scratch would be really difficult. For example, if I want to say, I need to have a meeting with these 4 people, and I need that meeting to be in Building 42, and I need a conference room that has both a projector and a conference calling mechanism and the ability to record that meeting, I can through a single API call, I can ask Exchange to tell me when the next time all 4 of those people are available and there's a room that has all of those features that I need are available at the same time. So, you know, the ability to get to all of that functionality through COM is awesome. And you're right. I mean, for rich instrumentation, you would use either WMI or the Enterprise Instrumentation Framework. So before we look at the .NET interface, I just want to point out that one of the other things that people are having some fun with is that there are some technologies emerging that let you take your core PHP code that you've developed in your web application and actually run them without a web server, so run them on your desktop. There's a managed code implementation of PHP called Phalanger. All of the libraries aren't ported, but it gives you full .NET. It's a full .NET runtime, so you can check that out. You can either see it at phpcompiler.net is the older version, and the new version is available on codeplex.com. A couple other things. The guys at Newsphere have created this product, PHP Dock, which basically embeds a little web server and means you can run your PHP application standalone, and it works exactly the same way as if it were being fed through a web server. So it can be desktop, disconnected desktop only. Winbinder is another one that provides you the capability to create VB6 style user interface, but use PHP in your code behind, so you can get code reuse if you're building web applications, but you want to leverage some of that, some of the logic that you develop in your standalone Windows applications. And one of the things that's starting to gain some popularity is using GTK with the PHP GTK library to create GUI applications that use PHP as the application behind it. Which, well, so the question is, which one's faster, native PHP or with Phalanger? Phalanger's, at least in my anecdotal tests, Phalanger is way faster. But the thing to remember about Phalanger is that it's an implementation of the core of PHP. But if you're going to use it for PHP work, then you'd have to either recreate libraries or port the libraries that you would want to use. So, you know, practically speaking, if you're going to write an application that runs in isolation, you're not going to try and use, you know, Mambo, for example, or Drupal, then you could use Phalanger. But in most cases, that means that you're restricted to only the code that you write, which for most PHP developers is a showstopper. So the next opportunity is, I've shown you COM, but the world is .NET, right? So in the Microsoft world, all the new development for the most part is being done on .NET. And luckily, there's a way to access .NET technology from your PHP code as well. It's not how I want the experience to work. We're hoping that there will be a native .NET interface, whether it's actually hosting the common language runtime. I'm not sure exactly what form it will take. But right now, the way that it works is using the COM extension for PHP. When you develop a .NET application, there's a simple compile and link option that will allow you to expose your .NET object as a COM object. And what that does, and this is no code you have to write, it's just a build option. But what that does is it creates a very thin COM veneer that makes that .NET object look just like a COM object to the COM world. So there's a little teeny COM object that gets registered in the registry on Windows just like any other COM object. And then you can use that veneer to access the .NET application from your PHP code. So I've got an example of that here. And again, in this case, just getting the machine name. But anybody know how you do that in PHP, by the way? Get the current machine name. And again, using that web farm debugging experience, you might want to know when a user has an error, what is the machine name that error was propagated on. You want to add that to your trace information that you store in a log file. So doing that in .NET, terribly complex, one line of code in VB. Right? And one of the advantages of .NET is, you can see I'm skipping around the PowerPoint. I tell folks I'm a big fan of PowerPoint as a Microsoft shareholder, but not so much as a user. So one of the advantages of .NET is that one of the fundamental design premises was to take 80% of the normal plumbing work that developers do from one day to the next and wrap that in a well-factored, easy-to-access set of libraries so that you don't have to write that plumbing code yourself. Shared source CLI, and here's some of the base class libraries. So you look at things like session state and security and caching and data access and diagnostics and all of those sorts of things that you might have to write from scratch. They're simply accessible through the base class libraries in the .NET framework. And you can write your code. Right? In this case, this is the entire COM callable veneer that calls into the .NET framework, and it's now accessible as a COM object from PHP code. And somewhere in here, in the properties setting for this project, I just select register for COM interop, and that's all it takes. The Visual Studio just automatically builds that thin COM object layer, and that's all it takes to access that. Right? So again, trivial example, but the point is that it's this easy to get to all of those tens of thousands of objects that live in the .NET framework that you might want to call. Any questions about .NET Access? What you can do, what you can't do? Want to know what the problems are? Okay. Yeah. So, I was thinking I was going to get away without that question. So, the veneer is really lightweight, and I've run COM interop performance tests, not directly from PHP, because really the barrier isn't the barrier isn't PHP to COM that we were using anyway. The real performance issue is what's the impact on the COM interop layer calling .NET objects as COM objects. I've run some tests. I did some playing around with writing doing some Quake gaming stuff using the DirectX libraries, which are all COM, and I found the performance impact to be really minimal. The potential problem with COM interop, though, is that, has anybody done any extensive COM interop programming with .NET? Did you run into any race conditions with garbage collection? So remember how that works is, everybody's heard about garbage collection in .NET and how that means that we as programmers now, we can forget about memory and we can create new objects, and we don't have to worry about cleaning up after ourselves, and they just auto-magically go away, and that always works, right? Everybody buy that? Not so much. So one of the problems is that COM didn't have garbage collection. COM uses a reference counting-based mechanism to determine when objects need to be disposed of. Now, if you're a C++ programmer and you're doing COM, you're doing that manually. But for most COM object programming in VB or even Delphi or PowerBuilder or whatever, that was managed by the runtime. So the potential problem from a performance perspective is that when you create objects through COM interop, there's a COM object that's created, and then whatever objects get created in your .NET code get created. And we use what's called a two-pass garbage collector, which means that when you're no longer using an object, it's marked as collectible, but it's not collected right away because invoking the garbage collector is pretty processor intensive. So we don't want to invoke the garbage collector until we have a memory consumption condition that requires more memory. Then we'll call a second pass to the garbage collector, and the things that aren't being used will be freed, and memory gets reorganized. But you can run into problems if you have COM objects that are still being held on to, especially if on your PHP side you don't get rid of those COM objects. You just dim them up, and then you have a bad programming practice where you leave them hanging around. Those COM objects are still holding references to unused but not disposed of objects in the .NET stack. So you You can run into some race conditions, but for the most part, I haven't seen those in PHP interop code. But there is a minor performance hit, and at some point, I hope that we have a real native calling experience. And I don't know exactly what form that will take. We're doing some research on it, and folks at Zen are doing some research on it as well. Any other questions about the interop stuff? Okay, a couple other things. First being web services. So XML web services have been a really sort of a boon to interop of all types, between applications, between platforms, and I don't want to oversimplify calling between applications. XML web services are a great mechanism when the performance and other conditions of your application make that a possibility. But calling XML-based web services does come with some overhead. One of the great things about developing web services in .NET is you don't have to worry about the plumbing of XML web services, the SOAP, the WSDL, right? WSDL is basically the API. It's the, if you're a Windows programmer, it's the IDL for XML web services. Anybody know what WSDL stands for? Web Services Description Language. Yeah, unless you do interop, and then you have to write it by hand, and then it's called the We Suffer Daily language because it's really terse. And our marketing folks are fond of saying, you know, one of the big benefits of XML is that it's human readable. I don't know what kind of humans they're hanging out with in the marketing department, but I'm not sure I agree that it's human readable. But one of the great things about doing web service development in ASP.NET is that the runtime does the vast majority of the work for you. So in this case, this is an entire web service. And it's a web service only because I've imported the web services namespace, my class has these web service attributes, and I've decorated the method that I want to call with this web method attribute. I don't have to write WSDL. I don't have to worry about the SOAP envelope and building that XML object that's going to be serialized across the wire to the, whatever the calling application is. So to the VB programmer in this case, and it works the same in C#, to the VB programmer, this is just a method, a class method like any other class method that they'd write, and I decorate it with the web method attribute. So the other thing that you get with in .NET is you get a web service, a test harness for free. And so you'll notice what this bit of the application does is send in an IP address, and then the presumption on the other side is that they'll use another web service to look up the geographic location that web service came from, so they can custom tailor the information that's going back to the browser. Right. So we get a test harness, and note this is just a IE version of the XML that gets returned, but all of the WSDL is dynamically generated for us. Right? So really easy to do on the .NET side, much easier, I think, than lots of other development platforms. Yes?
What's the WCF story? Similarly easy, or?
Yes. So I mean, from a development perspective,
Development, performance?
well, so performance for WCF is better.
Right. I guess that's all WCF.
Right. From a development perspective, WCF has, there's the same presumption that you don't have to work, you don't have to do all the plumbing unless you need, you need or want to get into the plumbing. But support all of the standards. So calling a WCF service, the calling end will never know that it's a WCF service. It returns a SOAP-based message just like any other XML web service, if SOAP is what you want to talk. Right? And we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the AJAX piece. Over on our PHP side, and I wrote this code a little while ago. I'm a fan of the new SOAP library, and with PHP 5, there's web service support built in. But you'll note here that basically I dim up an instance of the new SOAP client. And if you try this, by the way, I'll make all of this code available for you to play with if you want. But if you try this, one of the things that you'll note is that there's a naming collision between the new SOAP libraries and the SOAP 5 libraries. So you just have to rename some stuff in the new SOAP libraries. But so I'm just telling the new SOAP client where the WSDL is. New SOAP handles the rest of the GUC for me. So new SOAP just downloads the WSDL file in real time, and then I could just call the method on that web service that I want. And the great thing about this is it means that if you have PHP applications that are running now in your infrastructure, even if they're running on a Linux box, you can start to do some of your business logic development in ASP.NET on a Windows box, still call it from your PHP application. So you don't have to make that choice that we've had to make in the past that says, I either need to do all LAMP stack or all Windows stuff, but you get the best of both worlds. So since you're asking about WCF, this is an AJAX application, obviously running here in PHP, using the Microsoft AJAX stack. Now, we think you get the best AJAX development experience if you're using ASP.NET on the server side. But we understand that everybody's not doing that. So the client libraries are 100% platform and browser independent. And we provide, by way of the Codeplex repository, right now there's a sample of doing the server side of our AJAX stack from PHP. It's actually embedded in this code. There's another one for Cold Fusion, and I'm working on one for JSP. The idea behind this app is this is just like a collaboration app. So and notice how a couple of seconds after I added, there was a AJAX call. I didn't get a full page refresh, so it's a true dynamic partial page update using AJAX technology. Now in a second, that'll pop up. Right? So it's real AJAX technology. One of the things that you were asking about what happens when WCF appears and is there a difference in calling mechanisms? One of the great things about our client-side implementation is that its back-end independence provides some advantages, and I'm going to show you bits of those. If you're interested in our AJAX stuff, by the way, if you go to ajax.asp.net on the web, I have about 40 short tutorials on how to use our AJAX stuff. So on the client side here, it's just got this note service, right? And in this case, I'm just retrieving data out of a text file, but this could be coming out of a feed or a database or whatever you want. But one of the interesting things is, if you look on the client side, this is where I'm including all JavaScript runtime. So this is just JavaScript code that runs inside the browser. It's browser and platform independent. And one of the things that happens by way of this JavaScript in the AJAX library is, oops. Notice no place here have I had to do a lot of coding to call the code back on the server side. I'm basically just specifying where that service is, which I'm doing here, and then I can create the instance of the object, of the proxy object that I want to talk to, and make the calls against that server. There's no, here's what the input and output parameters are, that sort of thing. And the reason that that's possible is that the client-side AJAX library has this thing called a script manager. And when you provide it with the URL of a resource that you want to call, it's expected that that resource will dynamically generate the JavaScript code that you need to call that AJAX service. So what that means is that if, for example, you have XML web services today and you want to change the service to sometime in the future to be a WCF service, you don't have to change your client-side code at all. The calling mechanism is that you call the URL with a /JS, and on the PHP side, this is the server implementation. There's this proxy generator that gets called in response to a /JS, and it actually generates the JavaScript code that will handle all the JSON serialization. And it does that at runtime. So if you want to unplug your AJAX service and plug in a different one, for example, based on WCF, as long as whatever you provide on the server knows how to answer a /JS call with the JavaScript to call itself, that's all the client needs, because the client's just going to use whatever code gets downloaded. So it all happens dynamically. Now, if you're using the ASP.NET stuff on the server, you get other benefits as well. So one of the coolest things, I think, is you get dynamic client-side user-defined type generation. So if you have written a C# or a VB class in your ASP.NET application and you want to return, say, a collection of object instances of that user-defined type, you don't have to write a JavaScript class to represent that data. It'll automatically, the script manager will automatically generate a JavaScript representation of the data portions of your user-defined type. Obviously, the methods wouldn't make any sense on the client, but the data would. So you do get some advantages. And at some point, I imagine, somebody will come along and implement the PHP side of those sorts of features as well. Right. So just a quick look at the Ajax stuff. Another thing that I've been playing around with is some of the live services, in particular Virtual Earth. The application that I'm working on is doing some proximity searching. So on the kickboxing site that I showed you earlier, there are always guys posting in the forums that are looking for people within driving distance they can go practice with. So I'm working on a prototype that will use Virtual Earth, uses the addresses that they list in their profiles, which is this map is the address, actually my house, it's the address that I've listed in my profile in this XOOPS install. And basically I'm working on a prototype that will let me call the Virtual Earth web service, passing in a particular geographic or an address, get back longitude and latitude, and then do a proximity search for other people that are within a certain radius of me so that I can let people know, who's close to me. But this is, so remember we're all in PHP code here. This is the Virtual Earth control. This is all JavaScript. So if we look at the actual code, right, we're actually just pulling in this map control.js file from the Virtual Earth website. So it's just JavaScript, runs cross-browser, cross-platform. And I can dynamically zoom in, zoom out, and again, all callable from PHP. One of the new extensions that's sort of interesting is this 3D control. This is not JavaScript. This is a browser plugin. So I can do sort of interesting things. And again, this is all inside PHP code. Right? So I can, do pan and, look at the horizon, that sort of thing. And there's just a whole plethora of service callable methods that are available in local live. So you can do things like, I'm driving from here to here. Plot me on the map all of the Starbucks locations between where I'm starting and where I'm going because I need to stay highly caffeinated for the whole drive. This push pin right here, this is an overlay. Oh, I'm sorry, it's right here. This is an overlay, is a push pin that is placed on the map by the web service, and you can do that with basically any location that you can identify in your application. Last thing I'll show you in this demo is we've been hearing a lot about Silverlight in the conference so far. So one of the things to remember is that certainly, like all the things that we do, there's an improved development experience if you're using Visual Studio and you're using some of the server-side technologies that are available, but Silverlight is a client technology, right? So it's a cross-platform, as Scott said in the keynote yesterday. It's a cross-platform implementation of the CLR, runs cross-browser. So here it is hosted. Here's a Silverlight application hosted inside a PHP application. And you can see that this is a fairly simple one, but you can see that the point here is that just as easy to host a Silverlight set of functionality, Silverlight controls inside a PHP application as it is in anything else. And that means that all of the rich media stuff, all of the vector-based graphic type user interface that you would develop using the expression products and Silverlight are now integratable into your PHP applications like Mambo or in this case XOOPS. Questions about that? So we talked about the COM callable wrapper and how we can get to basically all of the functionality that is in the Microsoft products and the products that are delivered by our partners, either by going through COM, by going through .NET, or by going through XML web services. And we saw in code how it's really pretty easy to call out to any one of those types of objects on the Windows side. In addition, there are, sorry, I'm skipping around in my deck here. There are a whole collection of other interop opportunities that might hook into stuff that you've already got. So all of this stuff is supported in both PHP and in Windows. Things like SMTP, X500, using the database. So there are now free versions of all of our developer tools and of SQL Server Express. And one of the cool things you can do with SQL Server 2005 is that you can publish web services, so XML callable web services, from directly inside the database with no middle tier object required, no proxy object. And that can be interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it means that your apps of any type can directly make web service calls to the database, not to an object that runs someplace and talks to the database, but to the database itself. It provides some simplicity in single point of access for security and authentication. Also, just from an infrastructure perspective, can allow you to eliminate a middle tier when that's appropriate. PHP has a session mechanism that is pluggable, so it's file-based by default, but in most large production applications that's displaced with a database version. So the fact that you're going to store session state in a database in your PHP application and a database in your ASP.NET application provides an opportunity for you to do that both in the same set of tables in the same database, and you get some integration that way. LDAP, of course, sockets, if you really need super high performant inter-process communication. RSS is another big one that people tend to think of RSS as only a blogging mechanism, but it's really easy to read and write RSS files from both PHP and from .NET. So if you're thinking about integration, remember that RSS might be an example. HTTP forms, the ability to post from a form that's developed in one development stack to a form developed in another development stack is a trick that I see lots of people doing in their first tier of integration between ASP.NET apps and PHP apps. So there are just tons and tons of options that are available. Or, of course, you can build your own. There are Visual C++ projects out there to let you build the entire PHP stack from source code if you want to. And if you do that, basically you can build in, link into your project anything that you want. All right. Any other questions about any of the stuff that I've shown you so far? No? Yes?
You proved us that PHP and its platforms getting along pretty well together. But could you summarize that 3 key arguments if I'm a PHP developer, why should I use Windows as a platform?
Why you should use Windows as a backdrop, or I mean, as a foundation platform. So the question is that can I summarize three strong reasons why you might choose to use PHP on Windows as opposed to on Linux? For me, it's the right, choosing the right tool for the right job, and you get lots of things as part of the Windows platform and ecosystem that you might not have access to. So I think you wanted 3 reasons, so I'll give you 3 reasons. The first is that the vast majority of desktops in any environment are Windows-based, some ridiculously high penetration. And that means that there's a lot of Windows infrastructure that is already going to be in most businesses. And if you're able to interoperate with that, Active Directory for authentication and authorization, the Exchange server for messaging and collaboration, SharePoint, for example, for internal workflow, and the list goes on and on. That's one reason, that you don't have to build things from scratch that are already available as products when that's cost effective for you. The second thing I'd say is that there just are things that, there are walls that you might run up against doing PHP on Linux that would require you to become a good C programmer in order to bypass. For example, if you need to do things like you have an application that just requires multi-threading, you're doing data acquisition or whatever. I'm using some uber technical examples, but there are roadblocks. There is a cost to that simplicity. If you're running PHP on Windows, that simplicity barrier is easily surpassed by getting a VB.NET or a C# programmer to write the piece that you need. I'd say the third thing from a business value perspective, and as developers, we never want to admit that there's, it's all about the code and it's about the technology, and we never want to admit that there's a guy or a lady with a wallet someplace that's really in charge of everything, but ultimately they are. And the supportability of being able to build multiple parts of your application with a single vendor for support, so you don't get to call the other guy. You're trying to make two things work together. The supportability, the one throat to choke, that can be a huge advantage for a lot of companies. A lot of the companies that I talk to that are doing PHP work, that's the thing that they're looking for. They're combining, they have a front-end application that is PHP based, that they started with an open source application. They're putting things like BizTalk's workflow and orchestration behind it, and they like the fact that they can use a SQL Server database, they can use BizTalk, and they have one place to go for all of those products, one support mechanism. They get one support contract, et cetera. So, but again, I do enough PHP programming that I don't ever want to come off like I'm pitching one thing over the other. I want, when I talk about PHP on Windows, I hope that I give you just one more set of things in your toolbox so that when your customer or your company comes to you with a problem, it's one more thing that you consider. Is there going to be an advantage to me to doing this on Windows as opposed to doing this on Linux? And I found that, the PHP, one of the great things about PHP and its simplicity is, for the most part, PHP is PHP no matter where you write and run it. Right? There are some exceptions to that. So, if you're, if I have a PHP application that does file I/O on a Linux box, right? How I access that file is going to be, syntactically just a little bit different on a Windows box. But for the most part, it's the same on, on any platform that you build and run on. Any other questions? Sure.
Did you experiment in generating XAML in PHP?
So the question is, have I experimented in generating XAML in PHP? And I haven't. So my team, I work for Scott Guthrie, and so I do a lot of work with the ASP.NET team, which is one of his orgs, and we also make the Silverlight stack. But during the alpha phase, things change so rapidly that you start playing around with something, and then there are breaking changes. But I fully intend to get back to it, because I think my personal opinion is, whether you're an ASP.NET developer or a PHP developer, Silverlight's going to change the way that we think about solutions. So I'm going to, in my copious free time, I'm going to play more and more with using Silverlight from PHP. Anybody else? Yes?
What was the federal agency you were working with?
I can't tell you. The question was, what is the federal agency that I was working with? And for the sixth grade reading level, that thing, that was actually it was a state agency. Okay. Sorry, I often tell a story about a federated application that I designed for one of the federal law enforcement agencies, and for me, that's one of the big deals about software as a service, and this Silverlight and Ajax and all this stuff we're talking about is building, in some respects, composite applications. And when I talk about composite applications or mashups, I don't necessarily mean just integrating YouTube and Dig, and I mean building applications that are federated. And I did some, in another life, I worked in federal law enforcement technology, and we played around with a design prototype that would let field surveillance officers improve how they acquire data about what we then called suspect, what we now call persons of interest. So, what's your name?
Russ.
So Russ, let's suppose Russ was a person of interest, and I was a field surveillance officer for one of these federal law enforcement agencies. My job would be to follow Russ around and make observations of all of his behaviors, and I had a really a high-tech piece of equipment by which I do that. It was a piece of rubber with some straps on it that would hold a pad, and I would drive and write. And this created, not only probably a health hazard, but it meant that whenever I lost you, so maybe I got stuck at a stoplight or cut off in traffic or whatever. Whenever I lost you, I couldn't start to add more data to my observation until I reacquired you, which might take me days. It might be the only way that I could reacquire my subject was to go back to their place of residence and wait for them to reappear. And that gap in observation created real problems in lots of investigations. Most of these investigations were conspiracy-based, so drug-related, organized crime, that sort of thing. So we played around with a prototype, and this prototype was something that you couldn't have built 5 years ago, right? But if you think about federated logic, and what we actually came up with was the field surveillance officer would have a laptop, and the laptop would have a wireless modem that would support SSL, so we have full secure communications, and a GPS interface to their laptop. And at any given point in time when I lost the person of interest that I was surveilling, I could hit a key on my laptop. The laptop would ask the GPS, what's your current longitude and latitude? The wireless modem, the laptop would create an SSL connection back to the data center, send in the longitude and latitude with along with the case number and the subject number that I was surveilling, and ask our big data center there through this web service call, hey, here's where I am and here's who I'm looking for. Tell me, do your thing. And the data warehouse would run this query and say, hey, because it's Tuesday and it's after 6 p.m., the 5 most likely places that you're going to reacquire that subject are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the order of likelihood based on the data in the data warehouse. And oh yeah, here's the map with the driving route for the first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one. And that that depends on the ability to make service-based calls in a federated way that we couldn't have built that even a few years ago. And so I thought that might have been. Whenever somebody says what agency, I'm just a little paranoid. Any other questions about PHP interfacing, some of the stuff that you might get out of extending your PHP applications with .NET technologies? Great. So one thing I just want to remind you is that we've developed free versions of all of our developer tools, and then we've done a really poor job at letting the world know that there are real free versions out there. So if you go to msdn.microsoft.com/express. You can download the free ones from there. They're about 30 megabytes to download. You can install them and play with them. The other thing I'd like to invite you to do is, in addition to filling out the evals for this session, I want to give you my email address. And I hope that you'll take down my email address and consider it a real invitation to email me. I always want to know, a big part of my job is providing feedback that I gather from the development community back to the product and feature teams in our group to help improve the products that we make. So I really want to know, if you're using .NET technologies, what works for you and what doesn't, and particularly if you're doing interoperability work with PHP or with anything else, what works, what doesn't, where do we have opportunities to make our platform better to support the language and development stack of your choice. So thanks very much. I appreciate you getting up early and being here.